I've described how our times are requiring an essential kind of growing up as a species, what creative systems theory calls a new cultural maturity. And I've noted that one of the best ways to make sense of the concept of cultural maturity is to examine some of the new abilities that cultural maturity's changes make possible. We've made a start by looking at how questions of all sorts are requiring us to assume new, quite ultimate kinds of responsibility, and also the ability to better get our minds around life's complexities and inherent uncertainties. A third needed and newly possible capacity is the ability to more maturely engage the fact of real limits. In episode number 2, we examined the evolution of narrative. There I touched on how the modern age story has been heroic, or better, heroic romantic. Both heroic and romantic narratives deny the fact of real limits. Heroic narratives describe overcoming obstacles to realize some ultimate achievement. Romantic narratives depict some meeting that dissolves limits in emotional or spiritual oneness. In modern advertising's continual reminder that we live in a time without limits, at least if we buy the right product, we hear an ultimate manifestation of the heroic, romantic, limits-denying myth. But increasingly, we are recognizing that we need to do a better job of appreciating the fact of real limits. If we don't, as with climate change or the possible use of weapons of mass destruction, we may be doomed. We have no choice but to learn to think in ways that not only acknowledge the fact of real limits, but appreciate the power of doing so. Culturally mature understanding offers that we might better recognize the fact of real limits. We better see that while some limits are there to be conquered, think of the 4-minute mile, other limits are inviolable. And more than just this, we better appreciate that the fact of real limits is in the end a good thing. Put simply, we begin to recognize that limits are essential to how things work. A look to life more generally points toward the needed larger truth. Cells can't live without their limiting cell membranes, and bears would be in real trouble if they thought they could fly. Today, this critical kind of recognition is key both to avoiding calamity and to appreciating the richness of new possibilities. A newly mature relationship to limits becomes part of the needed new common sense. Inherent limits in human systems are of multiple sorts. In my various writings, I go into depth with regard to many of the most important. The most obvious are physical limits, as with environmental constraints beyond just climate change. We confront them today with the extinction of species, limits to food supplies, clean air and water. We ignore such physical limits at our peril. Today, we also confront real economic limits. As a physician, I've written extensively about how the healthcare delivery crisis ultimately confronts us with real limits to what we can afford. Early innovations like sterile technique and penicillin were relatively cheap. Today, costs are spiraling beyond all reason and promise only to continue to do so. In a later episode, I'll address how acknowledging real economic limits will be essential to any long-term solution to the healthcare delivery crisis. I will argue, too, that a needed next chapter in the evolution of healthcare will in time require a new maturity in our relationship to the fact of death, life's ultimate limit. More generally, we need to better acknowledge limits to what we can know and control, something we are beginning to succeed at doing. I think of Heisenberg's familiar uncertainty principle in physics, and the simple recognition that much that is most important in our human functioning happens outside of conscious awareness is today assumed in psychology. We don't, in the same sense, get to be captain of the cellular ship. This fact of limits to what we can know and control might seem like an ultimate loss, but once again, it is only about seeing more clearly what is in fact the case. Some of the most important limits are interpersonal, limits to what one person can be for us and what we in turn can be for them. In my book On the Evolution of Intimacy, I describe how love that works in our time necessarily depends on an acknowledgement of this kind of limit. Making the other an answer that completes us as increasingly gets in the way of real love. I've also written extensively about the central significance that limits have with concepts of leadership and followership that can work going forward. Today we confront the importance of acknowledging the fact of real limits, even with the most immediate of choices. I remember at the start of the coronavirus pandemic recognizing that at least for a year I would not be able to do 3/4 of what had before been most significant in my life. I asked myself how, given these very real limits, I could most creatively and powerfully use my time. Accepting limits in this way let me find peace in the pandemic and turn my attention to completing a couple of important new books. Fail with many of the limits-related challenges I've just noted, and the results could be calamitous. With others, we will simply be left short of new possibilities. But if, as I've proposed, success with today's new possibilities is key to getting beyond today's crisis of purpose, then here too, effectively addressing limits becomes essential. We easily struggle with the task. We encounter one common result when people fail to acknowledge the fact of real limits with today's social and political circumstances. With populist thinking on both the political right and the political left, people commonly identify as victims, and more specifically as angry victims. The offending limit may be how quickly changes can happen, or simply how complex realities often in fact are. Historically, victimization may be very real and is important to acknowledge, but holding a victim narrative is different. The person then ends up speaking not from the whole of themselves, but from a reactive and ultimately disempowering and disempowered psychological part. Certainly then any degree of mature engagements becomes impossible. But affecting any kind of meaningful change also becomes very difficult. It's a topic I explore in depth in my book, Perspective and Guidance for a Time of Deep Discord. With the importance of recognizing the power of limits, we again find our now familiar apparent paradox. Acknowledged limits confronts us with a more demanding world, but successfully doing so in the end makes us more. And in fact, it is a straightforward recognition. It is only about seeing more clearly and in ways necessary to our time. If we are ready for the fact of real limits, we experience their presence as obvious as part of the needed new common sense. As always, I appreciate your thoughts and questions, and don't forget to sign up if you would like to receive weekly updates.